Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Welcome to the Daybreak Asia podcast. I'm Doug Kushner. The setup for today's session in the Asia Pacific was somewhat negative after a mostly down arrow story in the U.S., although, to be fair, the major U.S. indices did finish off session lows on signs of progress in nuclear talks with Iran. Lots of news after the bell. Netflix has declined to raise its takeover offer for Warner Brothers Discovery. It appears as though Paramount is set to take over Warner. Dell Technologies issued an outlook for annual sales above estimates. That's a sign of continued strong demand for those machines central to building AI data centers. And the fintech firm Block is cutting 4,000 employees. These cuts will reduce Block's workforce by nearly half. Block, you may know, was founded by Jack Dorsey, and the company has been placing bets on AI changing labor productivity. In Japan, tech shares are weak today, especially the semiconductors. And for a closer look at Japan's stock market, I'm joined by Bloomberg's Alice French. Alice covers Japanese equities, and she joins us from our studios in Tokyo. Thank you for being here. Talk to me a little bit about what you're seeing, particularly with the semiconductor stocks today.
Yeah, it's not looking great, right? It's the second day of declines here. It's really weighing down that blue chip Nikkei benchmark that we have here in Tokyo. Names like Advantest and Disco down this morning. Also, there's kind of AI-linked stocks, right? So SoftBank Group not having a good day either. And, you know, to an extent, it is kind of just follow through from obviously what we saw in the States overnight. I think, you know, people here as well just saying that investors' expectations for the NVIDIA results were just way too high and really just couldn't be met. And a lot of that kind of anticipation was already factored into the share price, right? But also more specifically here in Tokyo, we saw a really strong rally for the Nikkei on Wednesday. It ended up around 2% up. It reached a new high, and we're kind of already starting to approach that 60K mark, which is actually pretty crazy because we only hit 50K in October, right? And I think there's a little bit of caution setting in now about, are things looking overvalued? Do things look overheated? And I think kind of the first stocks to be hit are those chip stocks and those tech stocks that obviously saw a huge rally last year.
Sony Group seems to be bucking the weakness today. What's going on with Sony?
Yeah, Sony's having a really nice rally this morning, was up around 7% earlier. So they've upsized their share buyback program. So they're now planning to buy around 250 billion yen worth of their own stock through May. And this is part of kind of a broader move that they're making to kind of improve their capital efficiency, which of course is part of the kind of wider trend that we're seeing of better corporate governance and companies sort of trying to use their cash holdings more productively, right? And Sony, I think, one of the companies that's starting to kind of lead the way on that, and that's reflecting in the share price performance.
Alice, I'm hoping we can bring some of the economic news of the day into the conversation. Industrial production for the month of January rose 2.2%, much above forecast. And I'm wondering whether or not this will eventually feed into the corporate profit story.
Yeah, I mean, look, we just, ended obviously a really nice earnings season here. More than 50% of companies beating expectations. I think that's kind of fueling a lot of the international interest in Japanese stocks. In particular, I mean, you mentioned the output there. It is all looking very positive. But at the same time, we do have this backdrop of what's going to go on with the Bank of Japan, right? We know that obviously they are on that rate hike path. But there's been a lot of talk here in Tokyo this week about, Takaichi, the new Prime Minister, who obviously just won her landslide election victory. She has spoken in the past about sort of being perhaps not so in favor of rate hikes. And there were some local media reports this week as well, suggesting that she's expressed caution. And that has been good for equities in the past. But I think, the sort of mixed reaction that we've seen in stocks over the past couple of days sort of shows that, people aren't quite decided yet. We do want to see that kind of monetary policy normalization. Japan, obviously, getting on track for having kind of consistent inflation and things. But at the same time, obviously, rate hikes, traditionally not the best for the stock market, not the best for kind of corporate borrowing. And so it's interesting to kind of see those dynamics playing out all at once.
And yeah, today we had a pretty cool reading on core inflation in the Japanese capital. Tokyo CPI rising at a rate of 1.8% from last year. And from what I've read, some of this is due to utility subsidies put in place by the Prime Minister, right?
Yeah, and look, the Tokyo CPI is always like a little bit skewed because of those subsidies that you mentioned there. But yeah, I mean, the 1.8%, of course, we know that the BOJ has historically been looking for that 2% level. Now, whether or not this will actually feed into sort of their next rate hike decision, we don't know. But I will say, living here on the ground in Tokyo, it definitely doesn't feel like inflation is slowing down, right? You go to the supermarket, food prices are definitely still up there. I think we're definitely still feeling the impact of that weaker yen. Having said that, wages are rising, and particularly kind of big companies like car makers, they are on track to keep raising wages. So yeah, it will be interesting to see sort of when we have the next BOJ decision, how much, like you say, the inflation numbers do come up and what their views are.
And today's reading on retail sales for the month of January were quite strong. I think a month-on-month increase of 4.1%, way above expectations. So this also seems to suggest a fair amount of positivity in consumer sentiment.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what? That's actually nice to hear that retail data, because there have been some jitters here in the past few months about tourist spending, right? Of course, we know that we've seen record numbers of tourists coming to Japan in the past couple of years, partly because of the weak yen. But this sort of ongoing diplomatic spat that we've had with China for the past few months has been weighing on those Chinese tourist numbers. And we were seeing, particularly at department stores and things, that starting to hit the actual retail numbers. But it seems like those kind of initial worries and that caution has calmed down. And like you say, the domestic local spending does seem to be strong, which again, I'm sure will feed into the BOJ discussion.
So before I let you go, Alice, talk to me a little bit about the price action in some of the stocks that represent trading houses in Japan.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I said there that the Nikkei is struggling a little bit today because of tech stocks, but the broader topics index is actually eking out a small gain. And that's partly because, like you say, those trading houses are trading stronger today. Now, this is partly because we know that for a good long time now, Warren Buffett has been a fan of these trading houses. Berkshire Hathaway holds around a 10% stake in a lot of these companies. And a lot of investors hoping that Berkshire might mention them again in their annual shareholder letter, which I believe we're expecting tomorrow out of the US. I think it's going to be the first one under Greg Abel, the new CEO. So there's a lot of anticipation for those, and we'll see on Monday sort of how that plays out.
Alice, we'll leave it there. Thank you so very much for helping us understand a little bit about what's happening in the price action today in the Japanese stock market. Bloomberg's Alice French, she covers Japanese equities, joining from our studios in Tokyo here on the Daybreak Asia podcast. Welcome back to the Daybreak Asia podcast. I'm Doug Kushner. The U.S. and Iran wrapped up another round of indirect talks over Tehran's nuclear ambitions. However, the session ended without a deal. Even so, Oman said there had been significant progress. And according to Oman's foreign minister, negotiations will resume at a technical level next week in Vienna. And that's where we begin our conversation with Mara Rudman. Mara is a practitioner senior fellow at the Miller Center at the University of Virginia. She spoke with Bloomberg TV host Heidi Stroud-Watts and Shery on.
What's your sort of best assessment as to what's happening at the moment, and what level of negotiations and I guess minutiae might actually be being discussed right now?
Thanks. Well, first of all, it's good to be back with both of you. And I think I guess the best thing I can say right now is that it's a good thing to hear talks are continuing. In other words, that next week, in the coming days, the technical teams from both the United States and Iran, of course, mediated by Oman, will be together and meeting on details. So that's certainly more promising than hearing that things fell apart today. That said, there's still a lot of opaqueness involved. These are very high-risk negotiations, and with a very much decimated U.S. team of expertise to help to navigate this, and a tremendous amount of U.S. military resources out in the region right now as these talks are going on. So it's a challenging time.
And of course, what we're hearing from these talks so far in Geneva have been conflicting at times, right? Positive, very intense and serious. We've heard another report saying that the US side has been disappointed. What do you make of the expertise that's being brought to the table here, particularly as leading up to this, there was a lot of confusion even amongst US lawmakers as to what the administration wanted or what the president wanted from Iran?
Right. I think there's still confusion about what the president's ultimate goals are. As we know, in his State of the Union address earlier this week, he was not the paragon of clarity on this issue, and I would say on other issues as well, but with respect to Iran and why the United States is involved. So it seems that the reporting on the talks have been primarily or exclusively on the nuclear issue, which is clearly a key threat to the United States, to others in the region. But so is Iran's ballistic missile ability and its support for militias throughout the region. And so difficult as it may be to get to resolution on the nuclear issue, and I think there's some framing out there that points to a possible pathway, it's still highly problematic when the other two areas are not covered.
In the meantime, we continue to see the U.S. building up its military presence there. We're told it's the largest since before the Iraq War. We were just hearing from analysts, Pentagon's first kamikaze drone unit also being deployed. How much does this threat of a military strike make a difference to Iran when we have seen those targeted attacks back in June didn't necessarily change the game?
Right. Well, I think the Trump administration is clearly calculating that the threat will impact Iran's behavior and increase their willingness to negotiate. I'm not sure that, I don't think that assessment is shared by a number of other analysts. That said, reporting from today's round of conversations makes it seem that Iran is looking to make progress on these talks, is looking at different formulas that may allow President Trump to declare victory and yet still allow Iran to continue to function, both keeping the current regime in place, lifting sanctions, and having a very low level of enrichment going on with their nuclear activities. Very unclear, again, whether this will satisfy the Trump administration or all of the different players in the Trump administration, particularly when a subject like ballistic missiles may be off the table. Secretary Rubio, for example, has indicated that's highly problematic.
What's the state of the Iranian regime now, especially after the serious unrest, the most serious in decades that we've seen within the country?
So the regime is clearly clinging to power, has tremendous, the population is under tremendous economic duress, in large part because of the sanction regime that's in place, and is clearly, as the protest indicated, there's a high degree of dissatisfaction with the regime, but the regime's response to these protests was so draconian. Tens of thousands of people have been killed. And so they are, I believe what they were trying to do is show very clearly that they will not easily be removed. And I think one of the calculations and negotiations, such as those that are ongoing now with the Trump team, is if this regime is about its own preservation above all else, what levers do you have in terms of what you want to try to accomplish and how?
Why is the Trump administration focusing on Iran now? I mean, we do have an ongoing war with Ukraine. We do have the tariff wars ongoing as well. Why now? What's changed?
It is unclear. Certainly the threat that Iran poses has been consistent. And as President Trump himself said as recently as his State of the Union address, he repeated that the United States had played a major role in obliterating all of Iran's nuclear capacity. That clearly wasn't the case, though Iran was significantly set back, and they have repeatedly shown their ability to send forward ballistic missiles that have great regional, that are tremendous regional threat. And they're also continuing to support, though albeit at a reduced level, militia activity in the region, for example, the Houthis in Yemen. So there are very real threats there. But why now with President Trump is much harder to calculate. And some of the concern, certainly that those outside the administration have, is that he may be drawing the wrong conclusions from his activities with respect to Venezuela and removing the Venezuelan leader Maduro in what was a very successful military action, very risky but successful in terms of getting Maduro out and in terms of how the Trump team negotiated who's in control in Venezuela. And it would not be wise to assume that same approach would work in the same ways with respect to Iran.
How much of a strong hand do you think the Trump administration, the president, has when it comes to foreign policy strategy at the moment? We know that he's facing lower approvals and ratings and some issues back home. What sort of picture do you think would be being painted from the Iran side as they go into further negotiations?
So I believe President Trump has not shown signs of modulating his actions based on what popular opinion polling shows in the United States about what he is doing. He puts himself and his own interests, and I believe probably in his mind somehow the interests of the United States front and center. And so it's very hard for an outsider to get into that mindset and understand exactly what he's doing and why he's doing it. But I would not, I think it would be not a wise assumption to believe that President Trump is somehow going to pull back from the international space because domestically he's facing a high degree of unpopularity.
That's Mara Rudman from the Miller Center, speaking with Bloomberg TV host Haidi Stroud-Watts and Shery on, bringing you their conversation here on the Daybreak Asia podcast. Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Bloomberg Daybreak Asia Edition podcast. Each weekday, we look at the stories shaping markets, finance, and geopolitics in the Asia Pacific. You can find us on Apple, Spotify, the Bloomberg Podcast YouTube channel, or anywhere else you listen. Join us again tomorrow for insight on the market moves from Hong Kong to Singapore and Australia. I'm Doug Kushner, and this is Bloomberg.